Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RealClearPolitics, talking now with Phil Wegmann, our White House correspondent. And Phil's covering the the dying days of the administration. I don't mean melodramatic, but he's covering the last days of the Biden-Harris administration. And Phil, over the weekend, you got a question, and tell our listeners about that. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about covering it. And we can compare notes on, I covered Bush and Clinton. Now you're covering Biden. We talk about the differences.
So, in the final days of the Biden administration, you have seen a president who has receded from center stage. There are some Democrats who are complaining that he has given the spotlight to Donald Trump. And we saw this when the president-elect was in Notre Dame, and a number of G7 world leaders were very eager to speak with him and almost deal with him as if he was already president. We saw this also when, the Canadian Prime Minister traveled not to Washington, D.C. last week, but to Mar-a-Lago. And I think that with Biden, his focus now is very clearly on one thing, and that is reestablishing the peaceful transfer of power and then riding off into the sunset. He's getting his ducks in a row. He's finishing his unfinished business that he can without Congress, and then he's ready to exit center stage.
Well, and these pardons have attracted some attention, not all of it positive. I wanted to ask you about that though, Phil. The the um the administration, this incoming administration, I've never seen anything quite like it. But then again, you and I weren't alive for Grover Cleveland. Donald Trump is not an unknown entity. He's been president before. I got the feeling watching him in France that some of these leaders are trying to do a reset, and maybe they got off on the wrong foot on Trump. They maybe have underestimated him, or for whatever reason, underestimated his capacity to hurt them. What am I reading too much into it, or are these foreign leaders trying to think maybe they can do a better job this time around with Trump than they did before?
It was striking that you had Emmanuel Macron, who invited Trump to France for a ceremony commemorating the rebuilding of Notre Dame at a moment when all of these world leaders were trying to rebuild their own relationships with Trump. I think one thing that has changed is first, they already lived through the last 4 years of Donald Trump. They saw how it wasn't a government by bureaucracy or agent. It was instead a government by one man who often changed his mind pretty frequently and immediately told you about it. But I think the other thing that's occurring here, even if you look to France, is that some of these world leaders have seen populism rise up in their own countries. They're realizing that this is not a one-off, and that Donald Trump is perhaps a example of what's more to come. I think that's one significant change here. But the other thing is, the world very much is on fire currently, and the United States continues to be the world's biggest player.
So let me ask you about the White House press secretary. She's been under the gun in the last week. She was the one that said over and over again that the Hunter Biden pardon would not happen. The president said it himself a couple of times, but it was her reiteration of that many times, and with a little bit of attitude that has put her in the crosshairs. What is she like in these days? What's her attitude as she gets ready to leave with the president?
She's not letting the Iron Mask slip. At this last press briefing that we had on Friday, every reporter basically asked her if she was being honest with the American people, if the president was being honest with her when he gave her this information that she said again and again over the summer that the president would not pardon his own son. We even asked that question on numerous occasions. Now, the argument is that circumstances have changed, that Donald Trump and his incoming administration, they're out for vengeance. And so it was okay for the president to do what he promised not to. The thing about this, though, is Donald Trump's character and his eagerness to settle the score. That's not new. We could have said that at last December. We're saying it now. Instead, I think that what Biden decided to do was make this move when there was no more political risk to him, and so someone has to face the music. It's not the president. Instead, it's his press secretary, and this is becoming more of a theme. The two big promises from President Biden this year was first that he wasn't going to withdraw from the race. And then he did that. And now these pardons. All of Washington, D.C. now is buckling up to see who he pardons next.
You're listening to Phil Wegmann, White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief. You're listening to RCP Radio on Sirius XM or on our podcast, which we are expanding. So whatever format you're listening to, welcome. Phil, I want to ask you another thing. But I remember the contrast with Bill Clinton when he was president. He left, and George H.W. Bush was coming in. Clinton had also been impeached like Trump. He had also, like Trump, weathered it because he had said it was a partisan exercise. The majority of American people sided with President Clinton on that. But there's also and he had lost. He wanted his vice president to take over too, and that didn't happen. But the contrast that I see is Bill Clinton didn't look like he wanted to leave. I mean, he loved it. He did the White House Correspondents. They did this skit of him being home alone, and everybody wants him out of there. He doesn't want to leave, and then he did rallies his last day on January 20th, and he was actually speaking while Bush was, still president or become president. He hogged the camera, and it's forgotten now, and people don't think he meant anything bad towards Bush about it. He just loved the job. He loved politics so much. He couldn't wait. He just didn't want to go. Are you getting some of that feeling with Biden, or is it the opposite? There's a different thing. He's not able to run again because he's deemed to be too old. Is he just really wanting to get back to Delaware, or do you get the feeling that he'd like to be there another 4 years if he had his way?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but President Clinton is a younger man than Joe Biden. And I think that this is a mix of political exhaustion, but also personal exhaustion. It's a grueling schedule for any president. At the end of 4 years, Biden is looking to take a break. We were members of the traveling press pool with him yesterday as he was at the Kennedy Center Awards. And certainly, he did his best to celebrate each of the honorees. But as I was there at the Kennedy Center, and as I got closer and closer to 11 o'clock, I had to be thinking to myself, this is getting to be a little taxing, a little trying on Biden.
Well,
The
who's 82 years old? I mean,
He's 82 years old.
so, so you got in a question there, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah.
One of the things that we did not expect, no one expected, was that Bashar al-Assad, his regime that has been in control of Syria for half a century, would crumble. And it crumbled very quickly. This opens up all sorts of questions about the chemical weapons that are there, about the power vacuum that is there, and in particular, of interest to every journalist, the fate of a gentleman named Austin Tice. He's a journalist, an American, who was taken captive back in 2012. And there had been sort of competing reports of whether or not he was alive, where he was being held. And what we heard from the Biden administration yesterday is that they, in fact, do believe that he is alive. In a gaggle after President Biden's remarks, my question to him was whether or not the White House was going to direct the armed services to mount an operation to go get him. And the answer that I got from President Biden was, first, they had to figure out where he was.
Well, and Biden's had some success this year with bringing hostages back. My guess is that they'd prefer a diplomatic solution. Phil, as I think about it, and we have about 30 more seconds, that'd be a nice Christmas present for Joe Biden to give to Austin Tice's family. It'd be a nice Christmas present for the American people and for President Biden himself on the way out the door. Do you think is your guess they'll put some energy into trying to make this happen?
I think they're working overtime to not only bring Austin home, but also in this Syria development, they see this as corroboration of their efforts. They say that Iran cut and ran because they couldn't keep up their war with Israel thanks to U.S. support there. They say that Russia pulled out of Syria because of U.S. efforts in Ukraine. So this is sort of a bittersweet at least in their mind, confirmation of the outgoing president's foreign policy. And they would love nothing more to put a bow on it than to bring an American home for the holidays.
Well, that would be a wonderful present. We're going to leave it there. You've been listening to Phil Wegmann, White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, and we'll see you tomorrow on Sirius XM at 3 o'clock in the West, 6 p.m. here in the East, or on our podcast. So have a good evening.